Hello, everybody. This is June the 26th, 2020. And this is really an important update. Please, people on YouTube hanging, for the length of the video, there's a lot of information we're going to discuss today. Unfortunately, in the US, you're going to see there's a massive upsurge that we're going to discuss and some of the issue related to it. And as the economy is opening up, people are experimenting with different way of keeping people safe. So we'll talk about some of these issues there. So for people on YouTube, this is a quick debrief of my background. I've been very involved in the health tech space for the last 35 years. And as a result of that, including this week, I had access to 4 or 5 webinars, which I'll share at the end of the video with some of the top leaders in the healthcare space. So let's look at what's going on. Unfortunately, as you can see, South America continued to go up. Now the South America has 50% of the new cases. It's really getting the hotspot for the world. Brazil is number 1. Unfortunately, bad news, India is coming up. India has gone up 70% in the last 2 weeks, and that's, of course, extremely worrisome. We'll talk today in green. I'm trying to be positive. Some people tell me this video is kind of depressing. I'm trying to just share the facts. So there's going to be some interesting new information there about the key factors. And how to protect yourself, how you can disinfect your mask. And so we'll talk a bit about what we can practically do about this. And there's some healthcare robots in China. In the US, unfortunately, now we've gone to 33 states in an upsurge. And some of the numbers are stunning. Florida is up 66%, Arizona 77%, Texas 70%, Michigan 75%. And this is, and we'll talk about this, this is not more testing. It is clearly community spread. 7 states have shown the highest hospitalization rate ever. That include Texas and California, and Arizona, Nevada, and Missouri. The young population is now the highest category there for positive cases. And we'll talk about what that means. A lot of issue about mental health. And now people are putting new requirements for masks in California, Nevada, Washington, North Carolina. So let's look at the US and the world. We now have 1 million cases per week. That is stunning. We are now close to 10 million, probably by this weekend we'll pass 10 million. You can see on a worldwide basis, it continues to go up. And Brazil now is number 2. Oh, I cut part of it. And then Russia is following behind it. And here is India catching up with everybody there. So this is a very interesting graphic there that shows the number of days it took to have 1 million cases. So at the beginning, it took 100 days. And now it's taking less than 6 days. So it's clearly exponential on a worldwide basis. You can see that, if you look at the total confirmed cases there, North America was a big chunk. But now you can see South America and Asia. Without China, who are really kind of becoming the hot spots. If you look at growth from a 2-week basis, so that you can smooth some of the reporting issue there, you see Morocco just popped up. That's new. And then, of course, Brazil, Argentina, the whole South America, and Mexico is unfortunately not doing well. Oops. So the US today had the highest amount of cases ever. Last week, when I replaced this graphic there, it was 20,000 cases. Today, we did 40,000 cases in 1 day. So clearly, you can see a big jump. Before that, we will kind of bunch together now. Now we're basically catching up with Brazil. And that's very unfortunate there. And then, as I mentioned before, India, Russia, all those other countries, Mexico are catching up, which means on the number of cases, it continues to go up on a daily basis, which is really worrisome. And you can see now an uptick on the death rate. Remember, there's typically a delay of 3 weeks between you have an increase of the caseload and then you have an increase in the mortality. If globally, you can see how Latin America is now the highest part of the number of new deaths. It's pretty much, half of the death in the world on a daily basis there. So that's extremely worrisome because it just started there and it's going to continue to spread through South America. In Germany, they had an outbreak, again, in the meat packing, the same way we had in the US. Meat packing means high density and cold temperature. And they had 1,000 cases, and there are now, which was below 0.75 for Germany, jumped to 2.88. Germany immediately took step, isolated the plan, and took immediate steps. So they probably get under control very quickly. So if you look country by country, Brazil clearly up. US, we were going downwards, but we didn't wait long enough to reopen. I mean, that's the problem if you compare this to, like, say, Spain. You can see Spain is clearly, like the rest of Europe, going back to those normal there. Mexico, straight up. This is the steep part of the curve, and so is India. So Peru, this is good news. I've been trying to find good news every week. And Peru was very worrisome for a while. They had the highest, as well as Chile, some of the highest, number of cases there, but it seems to have been able to start controlling it. And so is Chile. And then Russia is clearly on the way down, controlling it also. So if you look at the positive test rate, about 5%, the target of the number of cases that are positive worldwide is around 5%. And the idea behind that is that that's when you can control the pandemic. And so the US is around here. But unfortunately, if you compare this graphic to the graphic I shared a week ago, the majority of the countries now are above 5%. On a global basis there, we're losing control of the virus, unfortunately, there. And now we're going to countries who have less capability of shutting down their economy or access to healthcare. You can see the numbers here in the number of daily positive cases. When you see Brazil as close to 37% of, that means they're not testing enough. That means the only people they're testing are people who have symptoms. Same thing for Peru and Chile and Mexico there. So these numbers are probably totally underestimating the number of people who have cases. US has lost control. If you look at the US, at Europe as a continent, they're around 250 million people, so it's roughly the same size than we are, and they're clearly going downwards, controlling it, opening up, but every time there's a little hot pocket, basically coming down the same way as China. We opened up, but we didn't control it, and now it's basically straight up. I mean, that's a very, very worrisome curve. So let's look at the US. I'm not spending too much time international because there's so much information about the US this week. For the first time, we did 40,000 cases. We are now the highest daily cases ever. This is not a little bump here. We're basically back in the same wave that we never got rid of. And it's the whole country is lightening up. If you look at the number of increase over a period of a week, so which is a nice way to look to smooth the curve. You can see that the South and the West is where things are happening. Texas, Florida, Oklahoma, Arizona. And the number of cases. Now, let's not be misled by the number of deaths because it takes 3 weeks delay. So I suspect 3 weeks from now, we're going to get an uptick in mortality in the US. Now, another way to look at this is to get rid of New York, New Jersey. New York, New Jersey are like Europe, and so is Massachusetts. And so what you see is that if you get rid of New York, New Jersey, which is the little dotted line there, we pretty much never had the control of the virus outside New York. And so as we reopened, it basically took off like a rocket. So this was a bit misleading because that was New York, New Jersey, where 41% of the death at that time, several weeks ago. So we had a full sense of security. Now, the numbers here are stunning. Oklahoma, in a period of a week, increased 111%. Arizona, 90%. These are big numbers. Texas, Florida, these are high population states. And so the country as a whole went up 25% in 1 week. So that's not good news. Let's look here on a state-by-state basis. You can see everything in red are a comparison to 2 weeks, so it's kind of give you a better perspective of what happened as we reopen. And it's stunning that you have so many states in the dark red, which is 100% growth in a period of 2 weeks. And that's being reflected here, Florida, Texas, Arizona, Mississippi, that whole southern area there is just lost control of the virus. This is a very interesting slide. It basically calculates the hotspot for the country as a whole. And you can see in April, it was in the Northeast, just because that's where we had the epidemic in the New York area there. And you can see the virus has been expanding south towards the west, which is what we're seeing there. And so it's an interesting way of tracking the virus basically spreading across the country. So we are going to keep track of that on a week-by-week basis, and I suspect you're going to see this moving towards Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, and hopefully California can control it. But it's clearly a trajectory there towards the south. So clearly, high temperature doesn't stop the virus. So if you look at the case at the peak level, we're the highest they've ever had, which is clearly not a reporting of testing issue, but the fact that they have an outbreak. It's all those areas that we just showed about. It's clearly the southeast and the southwest. If let's look state by state, Florida, they literally went from 700 cases to 4,000 cases on a daily basis there. Texas exploded 4x in a period of 2 weeks. Arizona, it's close to 8x, if I do my math right. California, unfortunately, doubled. And so these are all kind of worrisome trend. And you can see that this is coming from the government. This is the White House task force that has a whole bunch of index that calculate how the states are doing, and trending poorly is red, which unfortunately is most of the country. Another way to look at this is cases in the last 7 days, also same space. So all very consistent data. Is it a question with testing? Now, if you look at the number of tests, we've done 31 million tests. So we're starting to have the capacity to do the testing. Overall, we have 9% positive. You're going to see different numbers depending on different sources, between 9 to 13%. And then you look on the right side here, you can see some states, like New Jersey and Massachusetts, because they had an outbreak, they have a very high amount of positive cases that we're seeing there. So the good news, we're starting to do some good testing. But if it was just reporting more tests, this is not what's happening. And let me kind of walk you through this. A week ago, we were at 4.7%. We now are around 6% based on the same data sets. And you can see that clearly we're increasing the testing, but we're increasing the percent of the cases that are positive when you do the testing. And so let's look at it this way. 5% is the target that the World Health Organization has issued, about that you want to stay below that so you can control the pandemic. And you can see now we have 22 states that are above 5%, but that wasn't the case a couple of weeks ago. And Arizona is 23%, which means they're not really doing enough testing. Mississippi, South Carolina, these are very, very big numbers there. And it's not just the testing. You can see the Northeast is doing great. The whole Massachusetts, Vermont, New York area there is doing great. Midwest is controlling it. It's all the South and the Southwest. This is where we have the outbreak. And if you look at the number of tests, Florida is interesting. They did 10% less tests in the last week, and they had 66% increase of cases. So it's, and I don't know if it's for political reason or if they had some reporting issues or they just decide to slow down the testing there. Kentucky, same thing, and South Carolina, they had basically a flat number of tests, so no major negative on the growth rate. California did more tests, but we had a significantly higher amount of positive cases, which clearly means it's an outbreak. It's not just doing more tests and finding people in the population there. Another way to look at this is that if you look at the testing rate, you can see California is going up a little bit there, but look at Florida and Arizona. They just drastically increase, and we know they did lower testing, so they're clearly having a massive community outbreak in those two states, and Texas, unfortunately, too. I know we have some people from Texas on the call. We have been watching that R now. If you remember, the R now is that when you are sick, how many people do you infect? It's kind of a way to measure the contagion. Untreated and uncontrolled, the virus has an R now between 2.5 to 3.0, depending on the sources. 5 weeks ago, there were only 2 states just barely above 1. Now, in a period since we've started reopening, and we've gone from 2 to 33 states that are above 1. Not only are they above 1, but look at these numbers; they're significantly above 1. And so that's really worrisome, because that means the contagious is continuing to spread. Another way to look at this is the hot spot. You're looking at the county level, and really you can see in Texas, it's just Houston is expected to be worse than New York, which is really worrisome. That's a very big population. Florida, it's the north part of Florida there, and then we start to have some hot spot in the northern part of California, which is interesting. Another way to look at this is to look at the dark red colors, which shows over 100% growth. Look at Arizona. 3 weeks ago, they had 716 cases per day. Now they are 2,800. That's a massive growth. So is Florida, the quadruple in a period of 3 weeks. So It's all coming, as unfortunately we're turning red instead of green and yellow, if I simplify my heat map. Let's look at the death rate. Now, let's keep perspective. Some people have told me, well, but what about people die anyway from car accidents and all of that? Well, since this virus started there in a period of 3 months, we basically have number 3 causes of death in the US after heart disease and cancer. And the way this is going, it may pass cancer because the mortality rate, unfortunately, is not going in the right direction. But it's more than any type of stroke, Alzheimer's, diabetes, influenza by a factor 5x, and car accidents. And so I just want to try to give perspective, because when this number gets so big, it's easy to really realize, these are human lives that have been lost. This is a forecast that comes from the CDC. And this is the mortality we have, which is about 120,000. They are projecting by the end of July to be at 150K. But look at the different, they have different models, and I just put them in there for the fun of it. It goes from 136, which is doubtful because we're pretty much there, to over 170,000. And that's in the next 4 weeks. Okay. So the CMS has published their cost of taking care of the population over the age of 65, and which most of the people end up in the hospitals there. They already spent close to $2 billion in taking care of COVID patients in the hospitals, an average bill of $23,000. And that goes between $5,000, which is a quick, maybe ER visits there, to $63,000. And this is an interesting graphic. 79% of the patient who end up being hospitalized. So these are not people who are getting sick. These are people who end up losing control of that cytokine storm we talked in the past at around day 7 to 10. 79% have hypertension. But now what has been emerging is obesity and hyperlipidemia, which means high glucose, high liver, is coming up. So most people who end up in a hospital have pre-existing condition, which unfortunately is roughly half the country, if you include obesity and those kind of conditions there. If you look at people, what was the outcome of people going to the hospital? Unfortunately, the number of people who got discharged to the home versus dying are the same number, around 27 or 28%. And then we have to keep track of all these other people there who are being taken care in nursing home, in our area there. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the long-term effects. Most people are staying 7 days. That's a very long time. The average length of stays in the US is 4.5 days in a hospital there. But look at the number of people on ventilator. They can stay up to 30 days. This is not good. When you're ventilated for 30 days, there's a long secondary effects that you get. Now, I'm trying to get some good news thanks to some people on the call. I got access to some of the data from Massachusetts. So Massachusetts should be applauded. They went from 8% a positive rate to 1.8%. And you look at the dashboard, they pretty much have controlled the virus. It can be done. The Northeast has done it. The rest of the country just has to deal with the fact this thing is not going away, and you have to take some steps. And every citizen has to do it. We have no cure. We have no drugs. The only thing that works right now is distancing. They show their dashboard, and you can see the hospitalization rate. It's in all age group. Now, most of people are hospitalized are the elderly population. And of course, that's where you see the most of the mortality. But young people do end up in the hospitals, and some of them do die. So this is not a disease of the elderly. It's a disease of pre-existing conditions. California, we just passed 200,000 cases today. We had the highest daily cases ever. You can see, I think that was yesterday. And so we're going to get some crackdown, and it's mostly Southern California, but you can see clearly we never control it. And the new cases are clearly going up. Mortality rate is flat, but remember we have that 3 weeks delay. Most of that is Southern California, Imperial County, which is near San Diego, near the Mexican border. So there could be people coming across the border. Kings, Los Angeles, it's all Southern California. And you can see they're having a pretty high case rate per 100,000 there. I mean, compare Imperial, which is around 3,000 per 1,000 residents. And let me see if I can find San Francisco. It's 10x San Francisco. So clearly we have hotspot effects. This is San Francisco Bay Area. Most of us are San Francisco Bay Area. You can see we're having a problem in Alameda. It's clearly going back up. And we have a bit of a little bit of break that happened in some nursing home in Marin County, which is where you see that little blob there in Marin County there. but most of the problem we're having in the nursing home on the East Bay. This is that a positive that, the case we're looking for, which is how many cases per 10,000. Marin County is clearly going up. San Francisco is doing a great job, and so is Santa Cruz, probably because nobody's traveling there. In Santa Clara, we have a bit of an uptick there, but still pretty low numbers there. So I think overall the Bay Area is doing pretty well compared to the rest of the country. Los Angeles is the problem. It's all the hot spot there. We're averaging 5.3% positive rate in the state. And I cut it, unfortunately, there. And most of the cases, unfortunately, are the Latinos. They're significantly higher by 50% than the percent of the population. And that's really nothing to do with ethnicity. It's the fact that they have to work outside, they get exposed, they work in higher density population there. The other problem we're having in the country there is the younger population, unfortunately, are the one who are the asymptomatic carriers who are spreading the disease. And so in California, we are starting to see hospitalization going upwards, which is not a good trend. We're still doing a good job in keeping people outside the ICU because we're trying to give them oxygen much earlier and treating them with more aggressive drugs before they end up being on a ventilator. Because we know in New York, when you're on a ventilator, it's an 88% fatality rate. So we really want to avoid people being in the ICU. Let's talk about the virus. A lot of things have been discovered in the last week. It's astonishing, the rate of publication. This is an electron microscope of the virus, which is in the blue with the spikes around it attacking a cell. Something good news. I'm trying to get some good news. So as you know, people are developing blood clots. 30% of the patients are developing blood clots. And that's at any ages. That's why you see a 30-year-old having these massive strokes, and it doesn't make any sense. And then they discover he was positive for the virus. A group in Israel has identified that there is a marker, and it's called alpha defensin. And that's good news because that means we could start doing diagnostics and find out that somebody is having a problem. So if you are a carrier of this alpha defensin in high dose, that means your blood will clot faster. So if you go to that cytokine storm around day 8 to 10, and you are a carrier and you have normally a higher level of those doses, that means you're extremely high risk. And therefore, there's a drug called colchicine, I may not say it right, which is something that's used for gut attacks. And they're in the process in Israel, they've done tests on mice, and it seems to be working very well at controlling that blood clot factor. And now they're doing all the testing, probably very quickly in a matter of weeks, they're going to be doing testing on human to see if they can stop. And that would be fantastic news because that has been a nightmare in the hospital setting with these blood clots. There's a lot of concern about long-term recovery. A lot of these survivors, this is not like the flu where you're miserable for a couple of weeks and then you slowly go back to normal. People have long-term damage, and not to make you sick, but these are picture of lungs. If you have seen X-ray there, it shouldn't be all those white, and it's damage, permanent damage to the lungs. And these are an autopsy, unfortunately, somebody who died. And you can see a normal lung there. This is the lungs of somebody with COVID who has been absolutely destroyed by the virus there. So what people are seeing is that the survivors, they have this permanent damage, from what we can know so far, into the lungs. People end up with damage to the kidneys from these blood clots, and part of the fact the virus is attacking the kidneys, so they end up in dialysis. And so we should not assume that it's just a lottery there and maybe 20% of you end up in the hospitals and then you'll survive and then you'll be fine. It's not the case. Survivors, even people with mild cases who never end up in the hospitals, have some of these damages. So please try to tell your kids who are thinking they're invincible that they really need to be careful. If you want to if you read more about it, I put the link here from the San Francisco Gate. There's a lot of stories of survivors there who have to, for months afterwards, are still fighting the disease and with chronic fatigue syndromes. And I don't know if you know, but every patient in the ICU end up in tube feeding. They're basically paralyzed. They're on their tummy. They are totally unaware. They're induced coma. And there's a lot of side consequences to those type of treatment. Not to keep you alive, but I'm just saying there's consequences to it. So let's talk a bit of virus mutation. Some of you were here a few weeks ago, and I want to bring it back because there's been some new news about that. Los Alamos did this analysis to do the full DNA of the virus, and they discovered that there's all these different mutations. There's the Wuhan, the original viruses. There's a specific form for the Belgian virus. And there's been this new mutation that came out of Germany. So in orange is the original mutation there. Germany mutated in early March, and that mutation has taken over the world. Okay? And there was this worry about, is something different about that virus. And this is a way to give you an idea. Globally there, this was the Wuhan virus, and you can see the blue, which is the J614, which you're going to hear more about, is the one taking over. And it took over England, and it took over New York, and it's taking over the US. So what we have discovered, and again, this is a picture of the virus. This is the little red is the virus inside the cell as it's doing its damage and duplicating. This is a representation of the virus. And this just came out from Script. And what they have discovered, which is really worrisome, is that mutation that I just described, the D614G, has 4 to 5 times more spikes than the prior Chinese mutation, which may explain why there was such a outbreak in New York and in part of Europe, because it's a more infectious disease. And the way they explain it, and again, there's probably going to be more publication about this because it's really big news. It's just hit the news in the last few days, so it's not, I think, on CNN yet, is that the spike, which is what is attacking the cell and attached to ACE2 receptors, is basically has 2 pieces, one in green, this is the spike, and one in blue. And this is an unstable structure from Wuhan. What the mutation has done, which unfortunately is Darwin working the wrong way, is to strengthen that mutation. So therefore, that spike is much stronger. And there's more of them. So that doesn't mean it's more lethal, but it's clearly more infectious. So it takes less viral load to get into your body, and it's much more aggressive there. This just came out, it's brand new news, please go check, it's a heavy things to read, but I kind of try to summarize it in plain English there. So that's something we need to keep an eye on. Now, on the good news side, there is this concept of the K factor that has come up, and in fact, some people here on the call will send me that information. And the idea behind it, if you look at the behavior of this virus, it's not like it's spreading like the flu does, and you basically somebody you get exposed to get the virus. It seems to need a certain amount of critical mass to create a hotspot, and the way it's expanding, which is the way we're seeing it in the south and the southeast right now, is to really go into a super spreading event. And how do we define a super spreading event? It's very loud, so people are speaking and screaming, and therefore the velocity of the droplets goes really fast. In an indoor, so there's no fresh air, and without rapid air turnover, which is typically happens, let's say, in a high-density stadium, for example. And meatpacking, for example, is the perfect environment for that. That's why you see a lot of the outbreak in the US and Europe in the meatpacking environment. And so the belief is that there is this K factor, which is a way to measure what's called the dispersion factor, which is how much of the transmission is due to a cluster. And what is discovered is that if you look at the 1918 influenza, the Spanish flu, it had a K of 1, which means it was diffusing slowly through the community, okay? Which is why it took several months, but it was like a wave slowly spreading. SARS had a K, the SARS in 2003 and the MRSA in 2012 had a K of 0.16 and 0.25. So they were relying on this cluster outbreak. And at the time, we were able to break this cluster, isolate them, and stop the spread of the virus. That's why there are only 8,000 cases. Fortunately for us is that this virus has a 0.1, which is even lower than the other one. And there was some interesting work done from the London School of, and where they showed that probably 10% of the cases lead to 80% of the spread. And so if this continues to get confirmed, it means that if we could isolate and get rid of these cluster events, we may have a huge impact in controlling the spread. Japan has done a study there showing there's a 19 times higher risk indoor than outdoors. Chinese showed that they look at 380 Chinese cluster, and 99% of them, everybody except one, were all indoors. So we need to restrict indoor gathering. Clearly bars, any high density area there where people are close together there, high public transportation, ships, factory, office building, all these areas in high density are going to be what create this cluster. It also makes it a little bit safer if you think about, can we go outdoor and, should you worry about outdoor? I mean, clearly outdoor is not as risky. And we saw that because when there were all these demonstrators, everybody was expecting a spike, and it hasn't happened because they were all outdoors in the sun. And the sun is fantastic at killing the virus. So this is really important. Hopefully people do something about that information, and it's just coming out. So CDC just did an update yesterday, and this is the head of the CDC. They've expanded the symptoms, including congestion, nausea, and diarrhea, which unfortunately are very vague, so it's not so specific. Remember, we talked about this in the past, that 2/3 of the patient lose their sense of smell and taste. That is the most critical determinant of this disease before you have anything else. So keep an eye if you have anything like that. They also came up with this bombshell with a lot of analysis to say they think that we're underreporting the number of cases by a factor of 10x. So they believe there could be up to 20 million of Americans that may be exposed. I personally have lost some confidence in the CDC because they have a tendency to make a lot of statement there and then to have to retract it. So I don't know if this is true. The White House has announced they want to do pool testing. Pool testing has been done in Asia very successfully. When you have an outbreak like we have, where you have millions of people exposed, you can no longer afford to do one test of a person at a time. So what you do is that you take a whole neighborhood, you put them all together in one big test sample, you run it through the machine, and if it's negative, everybody's negative. If it's positive, then you go deeper dive and you start testing, the individuals. So the idea is that we need a pool because we need to do more testing. This is worrisome. The majority of the cases growing up are between 20 to 44 years old. That doesn't mean they will die, but they are the carrier. They are the one that may have up to 50% who are asymptomatic, bringing it to people at risk. So I tell people there, it's really, it's your responsibility to make sure you don't accidentally give it to other people there. Obesity just came out to be another major factor, and obesity is defined as a BMI over 10%. And over 30, and this is interesting. Obese people breathe 50% more air than people who are very lean and mean. Therefore, you get more exposed because you basically take more air in, and that's because your metabolism is much harder because you have a higher amount of energy you have to create there. Obese people are uncomfortable wearing the mask. It's hard to wear the mask because they usually don't get themselves protected there, and it's becoming a leading determinant to see if you will end up in a hospital. So the CDC say lose weight. I say I don't think that's going to fix the problem in the next 3 weeks, but that's just me. Another study is showing that people at highest risk is men in obesity. This is another study that came out of the UK. And so being male and obese is a significant factor in the UK hospitals. And so one of the difference we're seeing between the population in China and the mortality rate they are versus us, we have a higher obesity rate than they had in China. So initially in China, they thought it was hypertension. Now we're discovering the obesity and diabetes is a higher percent of the population than you had in China. So we have a different population on the fatality rate. Part of that is inflammation in the adipose tissue, which is the fat tissue that are close to the organ. And remember, the organ under attack. So you basically have existing inflammation the virus is leveraging. 90% of the admission in the hospital are explained by comorbidity. It has nothing to do with age. We need to get rid of this whole idea that it's only for old people who end up in the hospital. It's really about your pre-existing condition. So if you look at hypertension, it's clearly for the older people, but the young people who are obese, that's the leading cause for them to be admitted. And diabetes. And so it's really important to look at the age group and to realize it's just aging gives you more comorbidities. It's not the aging that creates the problem, it's your pre-existing conditions. So another way to look at this came from the CDC. You can see that, unfortunately on the age group there, we're having a lot of the between 40 to 64 years old is where you have positive cases, but the mortality rate is, people who are older. Ethnicity, there's more people being tested on the Latino side. This is across the country, and this is around like a million cases, 2 million cases, but the mortality are the white. So yes, the Hispanic get the cases, but the people dying are the white non-Hispanic. So just be aware that we have to be aware that you're at a high risk. Now, it could be that we have more pre-existing condition, which I suspect is the case. You're going to see more masks being required, across the country. There's a big debate in some state where the Republican governor doesn't want to do the mask and the mayors want to do it. And so it's a very messy situation there, which no longer state by state, but it's really city by city. New York, New Jersey is going to be blocking access to these tri-states from people with high rates and requiring a 14-day quarantine. And that number is probably going to go up. And Texas just announced today they're closing their bar and they're suspending elective surgery because they're running out of beds in the hospitals there. They want to open the capacity there. Houston is at 97% capacity. Several experts told me this week that they expect Houston that could get worse than New York. So that's extremely worrisome. So a lot of self-quarantine, including the EU is probably going to block the Americans. I want to go back to that graphic. We talked about this briefly, and I want to make sure you understand the scale. So this was a study done in hospitals that was a controlled environment where they look at the infection rate of traditional respiratory infection, which disease is, based on humidity. And this may explains why in dry heat, which is what you see in the Southwest in particular there, the infection rate is multiplied by a factor 4 to 5x in dry heat. And that's probably because, you know, the droplets may be staying on surfaces longer. You know, we're trying to figure this out. So it's something we need to keep an eye on. And so as a result of that, people are doing a lot of work in buildings on upgrading the filters in the buildings. And there's a belief that the large droplets stay in the air longer and then maybe float around. So we're still trying to figure this out. Shield versus mask. Having a mask, versus a shield is a big debate going on right now. For people with glasses, at time you fog and you have to try to experiment there. If you want to be ultra safe, if you work in a healthcare setting, they use both to be ultra protected because you want to protect your eyes if you don't have glasses or you need to get goggles. It's also easier for people to see your face. A lot of people have problem hearing and they look at people's face to be able to understand it. Let's be practical. How can you protect yourself? Remember, we talk about your infection risk is multiplication of the amount of viral load you get from somebody multiplied by the amount of time you spend with that person. A second versus 2 hours is a big difference. And the frequency of how often you see that person there. So pretty much like 1918, the only thing that works is shelter in place and distancing. And indoor infection is much more dangerous than outdoor infection. That's the latest data there. Watch out for people with cough when they're downwind from you. So always look where the wind is because that can really spread the droplets further away. Mask, this is a quote from a physician there. He said, going out in public without a mask is like driving drunk. If you don't get hurt, you may kill somebody else. And I think we need to teach that to everybody around us. Fine, if you're invincible, that's fine, but you may kill your loved ones. How will you feel about that? So disinfection there, just to remind everybody, a cardboard, the virus can stay on it on your mail for 1 to 2 days, so put it in the sun. Metal surface is 3 to 4 days, so there's a lot of ways you can disinfect that. The Lysol, if you can find it. There's also this UVC light box. They've shown that putting your credit card, your phone, and all of that for 6 seconds inside this UV box, which you can buy on Amazon, will kill the virus there. But be very careful with UV light because you don't want to expose it to your skin and to your eyes because that will damage your body there. Experts recommend that if you do hot food takeout, make sure you reheat it in a microwave, discard the containers, and don't buy things that cannot be reheated like a salad because you don't know who handled it. Avoid public bathroom if you can. Don't make sure the hand dryer will basically spread the virus for the whole bathroom. And also there's been a lot of report that the flushing can get the particles in the air. So how do you decontaminate? Several ways have come up. If you have a washcloth, which is in a soft material there, you can just put it in the washing machine and the dryer. That will take care of it. You don't have to go to a high heat. I mean, just normal cycle. If you have an N95, there's 2 ways you can do it. The CDC and US Homeland Security is recommending to use a crock pot. And these are some of the instruction there. There's some video there, but the idea is that you make sure it is elevated so it doesn't get into the water there, and so the steam is what disinfects us. In the crock pot, it's for 30 minutes, let it dry for 1 hour, and there's another one that just came out from the American Society of Biology where you can use a microwave, which is a 1,000 kilowatt microwave, so not the small one there, and you just zap it for 3 minutes there. Same idea here. You put this concoction here. So it doesn't, there is heat steam that's being generated, and there's a steam that basically go through the little openings inside the N95. On the positive side, there's robots being developed in China. They're running out of healthcare workers, and so they have these $10,000 robots that go for the whole hospitals there. There's some robots, more expensive when they're doing disinfection, and it's it's much more acceptable in those countries there. In Wuhan, they had a ward of 200 people there. They had 12 robots that were pretty much delivering, and it was extremely contagious. They were delivering the food, the drinks, the drugs, and monitoring vital signs. I mean, they were basically out there to protect the healthcare workers' safety there. And let's talk about what's going on as far as drugs and vaccine. Just a reminder to everybody there, you have the viral load after you get exposed. And then you can start measuring your antibodies, and that takes a while too. So we are looking at treating disease with a multiplicity of drugs. This is not one silver drug that's going to fix us. That doesn't exist. So there's a lot of work doing antiviral, which is as you're basically fighting the viral load. As you're losing the battle there, that severe disease around 10 days. And then they're talking about immune booster. And we'll talk about some of the things they're working there. And then if unfortunately you get very sick, there's a whole bunch of therapy now that we're using. That's why you see the mortality rate going down, but you still have a lot of people in the ICU that may need to be treated there. Lots of vaccine. You need to understand not all the vaccines are the same. A lot of them have totally different mechanisms of action with different level of risk. Some of the one that I talk the most is the Moderna, which is using an RNA. We have never made a vaccine using RNA. It needs to be shipped at minus 80 degrees Celsius. So shipping this across the world at minus 80 degrees is going to be a major thing. And it's 2 doses. You need to be injected twice. So there's a lot of logistics to manage that. So we'll see how that works. And then you have people using existing process. And it's so we are not going to need one vaccine. Everybody's telling me we may end up with 5 or 6 vaccines that we use for different people and a combination of it. There's now 172 vaccines. Every week it goes up that are being tested. I've never seen anything worldwide. This amount of efforts from private and public companies is stunning. There's now 13 in clinical testing. If you remember, a couple of weeks ago, there was just a couple. The quick update, the Moderna, they already contracted with a company in Indiana to make 100 million vaccine by Q3. Well, that's assuming it works. Everybody's doing parallel building of their capability and gambling on that. Oxford AstraZeneca has started their trial in South Africa. That's the one that Europe has paid a few $1 billion to get access to 500 million doses, and so has the US. There is an effort there to use existing vaccine, like for example, the polio costs 6 cents, and something you put, it's like an oral dose you put on your mouth. And what they believe is that it could boost your antibodies during that time period that we need to get a vaccine specific to the disease. So there's 2 efforts. The MMR, they're going to do a trial in New Orleans on healthcare workers to see if that boosts the defense system. And then Dr. Gallo, I was on a webinar with him, and he's pushing this very hard, but he said there's nobody at the federal level that's doing any efforts to test this. J&J is combining a COVID gene with a modified adenovirus. And that's good news because we know how to make those in high quantity and high production. So the plans are in place. They started the trial in the US and Belgium. The Chinese are taking antibodies to neutralize the virus, and the data just got released, the initial data there. And they show that 90% of the people basically neutralize the virus after 14 days. So assuming that continues to go up, that could be great news. And planning to do phase 3 in Brazil because it's such a hot spot. Because remember, they need to do on thousands of patients. Another Chinese virus is modifying an adenovirus that was developed for the Ebola. The problem is that the Ebola vaccine did not develop enough antibodies for the Ebola, but hopefully it works for this one. Then there's the Pfizer-BioNTech, which they're doing 4 vaccines. They're using mRNA, which is this new technology I was talking about it. And Inovio, these are all the leading contestants right now, which is the NIH and Bill Gates working together there. And they're going to use an handheld electrical devices to open up the pores of your skin to transfer this high molecule vaccine inside your body there. So you can see there's a hodgepodge of multiplicity, and we need multiple shots on goals. So there's 434 treatments in trials. I'm not going to spend too much time because we've talked about this in the past. But remember, this ACE2 is hard to spike, which now we've discovered is 4 to 5 times higher spike in that mutation that's attaching to the body. So a lot of the therapies that we're trying right now is to block that attachment. That's around 2/3 of the efforts is doing this. A quick update there. We are experimenting on all these drugs to start to that exist on the market, like the colchicine that I talked about earlier there, antiparasites. There's a long list. The good news, we're experimenting on every drug and we're having some success. So the cocktails that are available to the doctors is increasing. Is the economy recovering? This is an interesting graphic that shows high mobility, high recovery, which of course is Taiwan, Hong Kong, and all those countries there, versus low mobility, low recovery, which is the worst of both worlds. You shut down the economy and you still have a recovery problem, which of course is Belgium and some part of Europe there. And what you don't want, of course, is to be in this one where you have low mobility and you're not having a good recovery there. So every country has a slightly different strategy and is handling it differently there. And so it is a concern because there was an analysis done by the World Economic Forum where they asked all these big mucky-muck economic experts that are working for government to say what was the biggest worry. And you can see a prolonged global recession was, the number one for 58% of this top economic advisor there. And of course, tied to that is high unemployment and another disease outbreak, which I think is what we're facing right now. The concern about that is that if this is what the hope was, which is the quick V and we're recovering, and this is what's happening right now, which is it's taking longer, more recession, they expect this could cost the world $5 trillion. And some economy like the US can probably handle that, but other countries may not. So I think we may have some political issue there worldwide. As a result of that, all the countries have pretty much done stimulus after stimulus. The US is talking about doing another one there. And to give you an idea of the amount of the stimulus there, this is what happened during the 2008 crisis there. And this is, we're talking to basically be higher than the stimulus we did in 2008. Human mobility is on the way back up. This is kind of wonderful with the GPS, what they can do. So they're keeping track, they're keeping track of what's happening. And you can see people, they went into the shutdown as the virus is going back up. But now you can see that we're going to get a problem there because we're clearly reopening, but the virus, has lost control. The UK is, everybody's developing contact tracing. And if you remember, Apple and Google have opened their API so you can get access to the GPS tracker, like I just showed you there. And so you can identify people who are doing contact tracing. The UK decided they didn't trust these companies and they tried to develop their own app, but they couldn't get through the iPhone Bluetooth blockage. And so they couldn't detect the iPhone. And so you see most of the Europeans now working with a consortium from Switzerland is now using the Apple, Google to keep track of it in a decentralized basis. What that means is that there's only certain information that goes over the cloud because a lot of concern about privacy. And then you get notified if somebody turns positive, but the information is protected. As a result of that, you're going to see many more trackers. And again, a way to keep track of, are people in confinement or not? And are they moving around or not? In China, they literally block you and they give you QR code and you can't get out of your neighborhood. I don't think the US can do that, but that's how they've controlled the crisis in those countries. As you probably know, in the stock market is going up and down like a yo-yo today. It just went down again today. But it still had mostly done a recovery, but I think the reality is settling in. So it'd be interesting to see what happens next week. I'm going to quickly go into some of this webinar I went to. This was a webinar by the editor of JAMA, which is a Journal of American Medical Association. And he basically said that we're going to be 3 scenarios as long as we don't have the herd immunity. And he says this disease is like a leaky bucket. As long as there's a hole, it's going to find a way to basically leak out. And he expects we're going to go for hills and valleys, and the South and Houston are going to get to peak level, maybe higher than New York. We're still in the first wave. This is not a second wave. It's the first wave that we never control. He says summer, the heat will not slowing down, and we're really seeing that. He says, distancing right now is the only option that we have. A big concern he has for school, for people with kids. He says, a lot of the kids right now are not getting immunized, and that's going to create another wave of problem there because they're skipping the vaccine. And we have to be realistic about the vaccine being available. I mean, he was not that optimistic about the vaccine being there right away. And right now he says the antibody serology test, because the infection rate is only 5% for the country as a whole, that means your sensitivity and specificity is only 50%. So that means if you have an antibody test and you're positive, that doesn't mean you're positive. And if you're negative, that doesn't mean you're negative. So it doesn't give you a certainty there. So just be aware. Cohen had another big conference with a lot of big names in there. And he says the payers are making a fortune right now. There is what's called the loss ratio. By law, they were supposed to spend 80% of the premium they collect from you to spend on healthcare. Right now, they're 60%, which has probably never happened in a long time. So because nobody's doing elective surgery and you're still paying your premium, they're basically collecting this huge amount of money there. So expect some interesting boomerang upsurge on this thing. So we'll see where that goes. And this was the chief digital officer of Cigna that was talking about this. Behavioral health is exploding. There's very high anxiety and depression going on. And 50% of people are not getting treatment because they're afraid to just be marked as having a mental health problem. The providers are going out of their way to moving everything to online, doing monitoring at home for patients who are being observed, who are at risk, and who have tested positive there. They pretty much went from 6% to 80% telehealth. And employers, they're so worried about how am I going to reopen my offices that everything else has stopped. So all this wellness and smoking cessation, all of that, there's no more efforts there because they're trying to figure out how to get people back to work. And there's all this conflicting regulation at the federal, the state, and the local levels. It's a nightmare. Another part of the conference there was the Don Rucker, who is the national coordinator for HHS. And he says, they're in the process there of improving the transparency of price information there. But everything has been put on hold because of COVID. And we talk about the 60% depression and 40% anxiety level have been measured in certain community there. It's a really big issue there. Look at the statistics here. You can see how from 2019 to the same time period during the COVID there, the explosion of anxiety and depression there in the Black population is the highest, and the Latino and all of that, so very high numbers there. So a lot of people are trying to provide telehealth and other type of means to reach out to people there. And then there was the head of Thermofischer, who is one of the people doing a lot of diagnostic tests. And we asked them, what do you think is going to happen to vaccine? And again, these are all the CEOs talking to each other. He says, maybe by the end of this fall, we may get a vaccine for the healthcare workers because we need to protect those people for what they expect a wave coming up by the end of the year. And by the fall of 2021, for the larger scale population, which I think is what everybody's expecting. And right now there's a problem there, which is most of the lab, the centralized lab, are doing the testing there. We need to get this to be a saliva test at home, and we're not there yet. And a lot of concern about supply chain, because a big concern is that we're trying to develop the supply chain for the PPE, which is the protection. But if there's another wave, we may have the same problem with China and India are basically stopping the products being exported at the border, and we've had problems with drugs, that are in short supply. So, and Dr. Fauci, he went on CNN and on in front of Congress to say this is a disturbing surge, which is a nice way to say, why didn't you listen to me? And he, it says, we need to go to pooling there because now there's too many people to test, and so they're exploring this at the White House. And he says he's optimistic, and that you're probably going to need 2 shots for these vaccines, and using what's called an adjuvant. An adjuvant is another drug that they give you the same time they give the vaccine to boost your antibody protection there. So we're basically putting everything in the kitchen sink to try to figure this one out.